What has Ole Miss football as such an intriguing development each and every year is Lane Kiffin. But what is it about him that everybody likes, and why are the Rebels rolling in recruiting?
Locked On presents The Portal, the daily podcast covering college football recruiting and everything NIL. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome back into the Portal Podcast. I am your host, Brian Smith, longtime college football recruiting analyst and writer. Thank you for making the Portal Podcast your first listen each and every day to keep up with all the latest happenings in the recruiting world, NIL, and the transfer portal. Today, going to be talking about Lane Kiffin, one of the most fascinating coaches from many perspectives in the college football landscape. And to do that, we're going to make it happen with my guy, Stephen Willis, Locked On Ole Miss. Look, I think Lane Kiffin is one of the most infuriating yet fascinating guys in the world. He knows how to get under people's skin with tweets. He knows how to really get underneath people's skin when he gets all fired up on the sidelines. But you can't argue that he's a good coach, and you can't argue that he's really passionate about recruiting, building his roster. There's so many ways to attack it, Stephen. And thank you once again for coming on the show. But why do you think people are so drawn to him overall? Like, if you could just pick one thing, people either like hate on his comments on X and different things. What is it about him that you think people get so riled up about?
That he has an opinion and he's willing to share it. And when other coaches just play the coach speak game, not want to upset, he generally, this is my opinion. This is what I am. Love me, hate me. It doesn't matter. I don't care either way. And I think that resonates with the recruits, honestly. That attitude right there, I think when was it? It was 15 years ago that Lane Kiffin made his way into a rap song lyric, basically, all of that stuff happening. And then the cult of Lane Kiffin kind of developed from there. The hilarious thing is, personality wise, he's not the person that he's portrayed as. He's not even a little bit. He's very reserved. He is somebody that is analytical and is really thinking man person. He doesn't go off half-cocked as emotional as a coach, but he's portrayed as basically Steve Spurrier on steroids, and that is his brand, and that has followed him no matter what he's done. That has been the thing that has followed him throughout his career.
Well, I think that you hit on a great point. I mean, this is a recruiting podcast, and I think it's one of the reasons that he has success with how he balances the portal and recruiting for Ole Miss and having what I would consider to be now a pretty stable roster for the Rebels. Are they perfect? No team is. But this is probably the most stable point they've been in your lifetime over a 3 to 5 year period, I would imagine. I mean, unless I'm missing something, Stephen, and I don't think they're going to go all of a sudden just fall off. We're both very high on a certain left-handed quarterback that's coming up. There are a lot of reasons to like them when it comes to recruiting. And Kiffin was always been known as a closer. He's a guy on the trail that gets after it. For those that don't know, whether he's recruiting against your school or recruiting for your school, he's going to put in effort. Why do you think kids are resonating with him besides the fact that he's definitely brash? You were 100% right about that. What else about him makes him attractive to recruits and maybe even their parents?
Yeah, I think the social media following is a recruiting tool more than anything else at this point. I think the fact that he has 17,000 followers or whatever on whatever service that works in his benefit and can get him into doors that otherwise he probably would not be able to get into. Now, you remember this, Brian. Let's see, back when I worked in college football in another lifetime ago, 15, 20 years ago, everything was about that 4-hour halo surrounding the school. That's what it was. You put almost all of your effort into 4 hours circle around the school campus, and you recruited those areas very hard. Lane Kiffin doesn't do that. Lane Kiffin is a very analytical guy. So what he has done, he recruits Mississippi hard, and he recruits Alabama to a certain extent pretty hard. And Louisiana, those home areas, yes, that's fine. But he has assembled a coaching staff and an player personnel department that have roots in California, in Texas, and Florida. those are going to be areas that he strategically hits and tries to get players out of. We're going to talk about Texas recruiting here in a little bit, but a lot of that has to do with Billy Glasscock, a former Texas GM, being brought in to be the general manager at Ole Miss. A GM from Rice brought in that had a reputation of being able to find players in the transfer portal. Lane Kiffin brought him in. So Lane Kiffin is kind of strategically placing his pieces around the boards to where he's hitting the high populated areas as well. Like Georgia, he goes into as well, not as much as Florida and Texas, but he's there. That area gives him the ability to be successful because in the event a player or two hits from these high population states, it's just going to build your class up a little higher.
I think so too. The four states that matter most are Georgia, Florida, Texas, and California. Louisiana, Ohio, Virginia, North Carolina. There's some others that are really good as well. But at the same time, population base and everything, he's pretty centrally located to a lot of the key states. You're less than 10 hours to about anything you need to be at for Ole Miss in any direction. You're going to get to, in Memphis is just right down the road, what, an hour, give or take. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting that they're able to do it. In my last part of this for the first segment here, with Ole Miss now kind of in the national spotlight, do you think they will try to branch out more? Meaning maybe he finds a guy that's got a connection to Philadelphia / South New Jersey or Washington, D.C. Do you think he'll do more of it, or he'll stick with what he's doing now and just grind?
Well, one thing about Lane Kiffin that is completely underrated when people talk about Lane Kiffin is his desire to win and him to do whatever it takes to win. When Chris Partridge was a defensive coordinator, he had ties to New Jersey. All of a sudden, there were 3 or 4 New Jersey players that were coming down to Ole Miss. He is going to get players wherever he can. Ole Miss famously in 2020 signed 2 players from Canada, a college in Canada. They're both playing in the NFL right now. Really good players. So if you can play, if you are somebody that he rates and he knows about you, he is going to put the effort in to get you. So I don't know if it's branching out, but I think just that he's centrally located in those highly population dense areas, and he is going to go out and find elite players wherever he can get them.
There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, Bobby Bowden did it that way. He'd steal one kid from Mississippi, maybe one from Alabama, but he got most of his kids in Florida and Georgia. Worked out okay. I mean, there's certain paths that just work. Kiffin's taken that and just added a little bit more with the California, Texas, and whatnot. So when we come back, we're going to talk about some specific recruits that are going to be looking at Ole Miss. One in particular that, quite frankly, is just jumping onto the radar. That is next here on The Portal. March basketball is here, and there's no better way to get in on the action than with PrizePicks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. With PrizePicks, you pick more or less on at least 2 player projections, and if you're right, you can win up to 1,000 times your cash. It's fast, easy, and it keeps every game more exciting. Building lineups, this week, for an example, I'm going to be using Jason Tatum for more than 29 points in a game, Anthony Davis for more than 12 rebounds. It's pretty simple. You use the players you know best to get yourself the winnings, and the fast payouts are really nice. You can get your money back within 15 minutes of the game being over. So download the app today and use code LOCKEDONCollege to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's Locked On College for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks, run your game. Stephen, one of my favorite things about scouting kids from the state of Mississippi, besides the fact that people in Mississippi are always so nice, is the fact that it's just randomness where kids often come from. You and I discussed this a little bit before the show. I asked you about the following player because I wasn't familiar with the high school. Darrion Kirksey is from, I believe, Harrison Central or something like that. It's southern Mississippi, but for those of us who aren't quite as familiar, could you give a geographical quote-unquote background of where this young man is playing?
Yeah, the kid is in Harrison County in Mississippi, which is the county that Gulfport is in, but he's not necessarily a coast kid. Harrison Central is a little bit up 49 if you look at that whenever you're leaving the coast. That's when you hit Harrison Central when you're heading up towards Weston. And they're not really known historically as a football factory. For whatever reason, it's not a football factory. I don't know if I've ever seen too many players that have come out of that school. I've worked at rivals. I've been in this game for about 20 years at this point. Harrison Central hasn't traditionally put a lot of players out, but that's the beauty of players like this. This is a situation whenever I was in school that nobody would have heard about this kid into the camp. He would have gone to a camp at Ole Miss, put up a 4.3 or something like that, and completely showed out. And all of a sudden, he gets 17 offers in the span of about 3 weeks. Now the offers are starting to pile up early on this player. He got an offer from Ole Miss. He has one from Bill Belichick. I think Bill Belichick in North Carolina was the first person to offer him, and he knows a little bit about player evaluation. So I expect Kirksey to really blow up. Now, everybody with Tristan Keys and Xavier McDonald and Jace, I forgot his last name. I apologize. The kid out of Greene County. The wide receivers in Mississippi, there's a deep class in that state. So when you add another wide receiver to the mix, it kind of gets a little bit interesting. So with this guy as a new recruit, my gut, and you might tell me if you agree with this, Ole Miss, Mississippi State, and Southern Mississippi until it's not. It's as simple as that. It's Ole Miss State or Southern Miss until it's not.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, LSU offers or Bama or something, it could change things. But Darrion Kirksey, 6'2", 195 pounds. He's a fast kid. He plays with coastline. I believe this is the kind of guy that is, quite frankly, the history of Mississippi. It's just like you said, out of nowhere, a kid from some random school that, like, you're like, what's going on? They were 3-5 last year. I didn't know they had anybody. Sometimes it's a kid at receiver. They didn't have a quarterback that was that great. They go play with a 7-on team that's got one. And you're like, oh, that kid can run. Well, Ole Miss was the second school to offer him. His first offer was like Tennessee State or something like that, like not even Power 4. So this just shows you how wild it can be. Even in today's scouting, Lane Kiffin, this to your point from earlier in the show, Stephen, if he sees it, he doesn't care what the rankings are. He trusts his own gut, his own eyes. So does his staff. That's one of the reasons I follow him, because too many staffs, they follow the leader too often. You can do that a little bit. There's certain kids that it's just dumb. You can watch 3 clips of Tristan Keys and go, okay, we should offer him. Well, great. So everybody else in the world can scout Tristan Keys. Finding diamonds in the rough in a state like Mississippi, where the talent is completely spread out, is hard. It's one of the harder states to scout because it's so massive. And so many kids, you have 1 or 2 kids at each school, and they don't always line up against somebody like them. So you really got to have an eye for it. It makes Ole Miss recruiting, Mississippi State recruiting, and Southern Miss recruiting different than just about anywhere else. It's really fascinating. Also on that note, Ole Miss, as we were talking about earlier, Cortez Redding is going to take an official visit to see the Rebels. He's a kid from the edge of Atlanta. He's a safety that's going to be a big-time recruit. He's got his visit lined up. He's got NC State, some other schools too. How much do you think Lane and his staff are trying to get into Georgia as compared to like last year? They killed it in Florida. And there's certainly nothing wrong with that. Do you think Georgia has become more of a priority, or is this just we caught one in the net and we're happy for it? Is there more of an emphasis on the Peach State or not?
I think there's always been an emphasis on the Peach State to varying levels of success. I mean, Caden Lee's from Georgia, for example. Caleb Odom is from Georgia. And I think you see a couple of guys from like Carrollton and Jonesboro and all that are safeties, that are defensive backs. I think Wes Neighbors has identified 2 or 3 players from that state, and they're kind of going all in. And of course, you want to set it up because one of the main players, if not the main recruit that they're going after this year, is Deuce Geralds out of Georgia. So you probably want to have a nice little circle that you can do and a group for Deuce Geralds to feel comfortable coming in. Maybe he knows these guys, maybe he doesn't, but surely they know a lot of them.
Yeah, I think that's a very accurate way to put it, because the Georgia kids, especially the Atlanta area, Gwinnett County, et cetera, and all around the city, really, it's all good. They know who each other are. If you talk to a D lineman like Deuce, and he's a great kid, you ask him about a receiver, he'll at least know who the kid is. So when you get a commitment from a kid, like let's say Redding, he's from Jonesboro, if he commits to the Rebels, Deuce will know within 20 minutes of that happening that he committed to the Rebels, or whatever school he goes to. This stuff matters. Good players want to play with other good players. And Ole Miss kind of just getting their toe into the Georgia waters, if you will, even if it's just one or two kids a year. Like Deuce Geralds is ranked in the top 25 players in the country by Rivals. That doesn't mean that he's perfect by any means, but as a pass rusher and as a well-built, ready-to-play guy out of high school, there aren't many like Deuce. I'm telling you, he can really get after it. I've seen him play multiple times in 5-on-5 tournaments, et cetera, and his high school tape is legit. So if they get another kid like Redding, who's another SEC-level recruit, that only gives Deuce and other players more of a reason to kind of really look at Ole Miss in a different light. Because 10 years ago, we wouldn't be talking about a guy like Deuce. Even though he's got family connection, it wouldn't have been a lock that they had a chance. I think they got a great shot at it. But Deuce has got a family connection, and they're recruiting there, and they're playing better. It's a cool thing to be a part of Ole Miss. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about Texas and how they've used the portal out of that state and how they're hitting that area a little bit harder. That is next here on The Portal. Texas is that state that just about everybody recruits, especially if you want offensive skill players, quarterbacks, running backs, and receivers, which obviously Kiffin is well known for. You're gonna look at that. The kid they got transferred in from Missouri is a Dallas area kid. Lacey, I believe his name. He's a kid from the greater Dallas area. That's another example of that. Do you think that is the other state that they're in it long term? Like definitely, because it seems like they're getting more and more visits each year. And I see when a kid, they put out those graphics on Instagram and X and all that stuff. Do you think that is the absolute no doubter? Texas is where Ole Miss is going to expand even more because like Florida is a lock now. That's and Lane's coached in California. If they can be involved in Texas, Stephen, consistently, that changes your program long term.
Yeah, and they've done things to it looks like they're putting down roots in Texas. Like really, like I said, Billy Glasscock, the GM, came from the University of Texas. They hired other player personnel people from like Rice, the Houston area, the Dallas area. You can see that they're hitting certain things. Randall Joyner is an excellent recruiter and defensive line coach. That's probably how they were able to pull Walter Nolan back because of the ties that they had in that state. And you look at now, it's starting to bear a little bit of fruit. Like Felix Ojo is going to take a official visit to Ole Miss, the offensive lineman, I think out of Mansfield. The 5-star. They are serious about Texas. They are going all in on Texas, and they kind of have the same worldview that I have when it comes to recruiting. And I've talked to you about this. Offensive linemen, quarterbacks, linebackers, stuff like that from the state of Texas. If you can find them, get them. They're going to be developed probably as well as anywhere else in the country. Skill players, cornerbacks, wide receivers, things like that. Florida. Georgia's going to have some stuff too. They're actually pretty good in the tight end position if you're trying to find a good tight end. But defensive line out of Mississippi, you can see that Lane Kiffin, through analytics and recruiting, is kind of figuring out where to get players of certain type. And Texas is a major piece on this board.
I would agree with that. And Texas has got the money, like their high school facilities. I can't put it into perspective just in words, but I've been to multiple schools where it was like being out of college. Their weight rooms. And I'm not exaggerating, like 20, 30 weight racks just for squats. I'm not exaggerating, like literally that many. And they're brand new. It looks like you walked into a brand new big box store that was selling refrigerators or something. Everything's clean. Everything's perfect. That's the weight rooms at these high schools. Like that's why these kids, as Steven noted, they're ready to play because it means something in their communities. And they push by the time they're 6th grade, football's on their mind all the time. And it's probably before then. They run it all the way through their cookie cutter programs from the youth leagues up. The kids know fundamentals and they can play pretty early. So I think the state of Texas, especially now that A&M and the Longhorns are involved, I mean, you're going to play in that state more often. When you go play at one of those places, you might as well scout the area too. Austin, Houston, San Antonio, in addition to Dallas is incredible. It's the best city of the group right now, and that's where Ole Miss has got the most roots. I think the Rebels are doing a pretty darn good job with that. Stephen, one last thing for you. With Ole Miss recruiting the way they are now, and they've got a pretty balanced staff, pretty balanced approach, do you think they'll take a few more guys from high school in this upcoming 26 class overall, or what do you think the plan is?
I think they're going to take more high school players this year because Mississippi is so good this year.
That's a key point. That's also a key point. Keep them home if you can, sure.
Yeah. You're going to end up with more Mississippi kids potentially this year than normal. So that might bump up the high school class to where honestly it looks like a normal high school class used to on National Signing Day, to where there's 23, 24, 25 kids in the high school ranks that Ole Miss has signed. I think you could see something like that. Now, there's still going to be 20 transfer portal because there's just a massive in and out of what they have going on. But yeah, I think the talent warrants that Ole Miss does a lot at the high school level. And to bring this point up, talking about another thing is Texas is so well developed. Kids in high school have almost hit their ceiling. You're not going to find a Chris Jones in Texas. You're not going to find that raw player that turns into a superstar and grows into it. Texas, that's the reason Texas defensive lineman is a little bit iffy, because what you see is kind of what you get. You're not going to have a situation to where all of a sudden there's going to be a massive jump between year one and year two in college.
Yeah, there's a lot of truth in that. Again, the weight rooms and the situation in that state is just, it's way different. So, Stephen, could you tell everybody where they can find your work, sir?
Check me out at the Locked On Ole Miss YouTube channel, wherever you get your podcast at Locked On Ole Miss. And of course, you can check me out on ABC 24 out of Memphis and all of that good stuff. We're kind of all over the place, and I do appreciate Brian having me on, man.
Absolutely. You can find the Portal Podcast, Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your downloads. And if you want to watch it on YouTube, you can do that too. Just type in LO-the-portal. We will be more than happy to talk recruiting every day, because that's what we do. Thank you very much, everybody. Come back and see us again soon.